And thanks everyone for joining us today for our Demystifying Systemic SEL series. If you've been with us before, you know that we've been digging into the 10 key elements that help integrate SEL throughout an entire education system. And so hopefully many of you have joined one of our past 6 webinars, one or more of our past 6 webinars. But if you haven't, we've covered explicit SEL instruction, integration into academics, youth voice, supportive learning environments, adult SEL, and supportive discipline. And if you've missed one or more of these webinars, you can view the recordings on our website. But today, we're going to be digging into a continuum of integrated support. And before we dig in, I just want to make a quick note about today's chat function. Because we've been really making an effort to ensure a safe and supportive environment during our webinars, we've had a change in our chat protocol, which means that we're no longer offering a live chat option between participants, but the Q&A feature is still open, and our team will be monitoring that and be able to see your questions and lift them up for this presentation. So let's dive in. I invite you, as we get started, just to reflect for yourself what comes to mind when you think of a system of integrated supports. What does this mean in your local context, whether you're working in a school or a district or an after-school program? How have you approached this, and how does SEL come into play? The way that we've thought about a continuum of integrated supports at Castle is really just a way for schools to address the unique strengths and needs of every single student in the building. In many places, I think if you've worked at a district or a school, you may have thought about this traditionally as different levels of academic support and behavior support. But when we're talking about social and emotional learning integrated throughout the entire system, we're talking about strengthening the entire triangle, the typical triangle that you think of when you think of a continuum of integrated supports. So both the academic and the behavior sides. And this is important for a number of reasons. First, because we know that academic learning is so closely tied to social and emotional learning. So if a child is having trouble in math content, it may have root causes that are social and emotional. And conversely, if a student is struggling socially and emotionally in a classroom, it might be because it has something to do with the academic learning. So integrating SEL throughout the continuum of supports helps us look at the whole child to make sure that all of the needs are met. Second, it's important because students have so many different interactions with adults and peers throughout the school day. They're starting their school day off with a bus driver. They're walking to school and greeted by security officers and interacting with teachers and deans and social workers and counselors and others. And when SEL goals and priorities are embedded across all of their systems of support, it helps to create that consistency and alignment across these experiences so that all the adults around them are really focused on their social, emotional, and academic growth holistically. So today we're really going to dig into what does this actually mean and what does this look like? And we're going to begin by taking a look at a school in Dayton, Ohio, and how they're thinking about this. So we're going to play a clip from a video. This is a longer video about SEL integrated into MTSS. And this video is actually not yet publicly available, but we will be sharing it with you when it is. But you get the sneak preview right now.
In West Carrollton School District near Dayton, Ohio, the SEL team began by integrating SEL practices into the systems of support already present.
It's not one-sided with behavioral support and necessarily one side with academic support. And the way I think of it, it's like the glue that kind of holds those two buckets, those two processes together. There is a return on investment both behaviorally and academically when SEL is implemented.
Julie Jones leads up the district's SEL team, which includes 3 SEL coaches, the assistant superintendent, principals, counselors, and teachers from each of the district's schools. Their training, collaboration, and guidance has given the district the ability to fulfill each tier of support in ways that are consistent across each building, but also allow for customized interventions based on grade level.
We greet students at the threshold, right, or at the door with a positive, warm greeting. We value and constantly foster positive relationships between students and teachers, students and other staff, and students to students. And then we implement strategies that help support positive relationships. Morning meeting and closing circle are a really good example of that. So teachers start their day with a morning meeting, which includes a greeting, includes a share, some team building activities, and maybe even a social emotional learning lesson. It's a great time to do that. And then closing circle has students reflect on the day and how they did, and it's a great time to do shout outs for students.
Here in the district, we realized that we were a little light on the Tier 2 interventions. We felt good about what we were offering at the Tier 1 level, and we have a lot of things in play for Tier 3, but we really wanted to focus on more of the Tier 2 level this year and in the future. So we've created some small group opportunities for our students. We have a combination of counselors working in small groups, and in that combination we have outside speakers coming in, mentors that are meeting with our students in small groups, and then our SEL coaches as well that have some short-term small groups taking place that are targeted to just behaviors maybe in that particular grade level. And then for Tier 3, moving into the very targeted areas of focus, we have a whole referral system for teachers to use that go directly to our SEL coaches who are licensed social workers and work very closely with families in crisis. So if a teacher sees anything that is kind of beyond the scope of what they can do in the classroom, they refer that to our SEL coaches, and they're able to just provide all the wraparound services necessary.
Great. Well, I'm now pleased to welcome our speakers into the conversation. So Dr. Dia Jackson, if you'll join me. Dr. Jackson is AIR's senior researcher in learning supports program area and leads research and technical assistance in projects with expertise in special education, best instructional practices, response to intervention, and multi-tiered systems of support and culturally responsive teaching. Welcome, Dr. Jackson. And I'd like to welcome Trish Schaefer. Trish oversees multi-tiered systems of support, social and emotional learning, restorative practices, and behavioral health and management for Washoe County School District, a large district in Northern Nevada. Hi, Trish. Great to have you both with us. I'm so excited to hear some of your experiences and bring your expertise into this conversation. And would love to just begin really sort of big picture here. How do you think about and how would you describe how SEL is integrated into a multi-tiered systems of support? And why is this integration so important?
So I'll start. Integrating SEL into MTSS is really critical, especially given where students are now and all that they've been through with the pandemic. When we think about a multi-tiered systems of support, we are talking about a proactive, preventative framework that integrates data and instruction to maximize student achievement and support students' academic, social, emotional, and behavioral needs. And we want to take a strengths-based perspective when we're doing that. So MTSS really offers us a framework to engage in data, make database decisions for program improvement, to improve our instruction, as well academic instruction, as well as our SEL instruction, as well as positive behavior supports for students. And we want that to be systemic. So SEL really marries well with MTSS in providing a systemic approach to implementing MTSS in a way that's culturally relevant and supportive and removes those barriers for historically underserved students.
Yeah, and just to build on that, I do believe that when MTSS is done well, it can be one of the greatest equity strategies that a school or a district can employ. Within that framework, I think also looking at the role of adult SEL and creating a self-awareness, a strong level of self-awareness within our adults so that they're aware of their bias and how that might show up when they're engaging in decision-making. Use that database decision-making allows our schools to look at a variety of different indicators and look at the health of their system. And I think when you integrate social emotional learning, you also bring in this other beautiful data set from, perhaps a social emotional competency perspective, but also from student voice, right? The students sitting in front of you when they're able to tell you more about their experiences and their learning. It's one of the greatest data sets any system or educator can have. And it really gives educators an opportunity to look at a holistic view of what's going on for our students.
Yeah, thanks so much. And Trish, in Washoe, I know you all have done this work for a little while. Wondering if you could share a little bit how you are conceptualizing, how do you define a multi-tiered system of support in Washoe, and how does that relate to SEL specifically?
For MTSS and Washoe, yeah, we have been engaging in this work for almost 20 years. Of course, we started with RTI and Pbis, but I think intuitively when you work with educators or families, we know we can't talk about behavioral needs without looking at academics, and can't talk about academics without looking at behavioral. So really from a whole child approach, and we're looking at social, emotional, behavioral, we're looking at attendance, and we're looking at academic performance. And in Washoe, we've been integrating this work from the very beginning. We partnered with you all, with Castle, in late fall 2011, and already had a strong system for MTSS in our district. So it was only natural to integrate and really talk about how the two can support each other.
Thanks, Trish. And I think, you know, one of the things, Dr. Jackson, you mentioned at the beginning, right, is like, as we're entering this year, especially too, we're seeing all of these priorities. They're sort of top of mind for folks who are working with students, where we're seeing concerns around attendance, around mental wellness, around academics, around behavior. You know, help us draw this through line. What role does social emotional learning play, and how does that integration with a multi-tiered system of support help them address all of these needs holistically?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I love how it was described in the video as the glue, right? So it really is this through line that helps bring together all of the supports that students need to be successful. So not just their academic supports, which is typically what we see within a multi-tiered system of support, but that framework, that MTSS framework, really allows the adults in the building to organize the supports and to implement them in a way that is seamless. So we would encourage schools to have an MTSS team that is really in charge of data, so that they can have one leadership team that pulls together all of these sources of data and is able to look at them holistically. And I would say start there. That really is one of the ways to make sure that your system is integrated. And to echo Trisha's point, it definitely starts with adult SEL. So making sure that your adults in the building have training and are able to really be aware of the competencies that they have and the areas that they want to strengthen is in terms of their social emotional capacity, right? So we want adults to be able to model these behaviors as they're implementing tiered supports in academics or in behavior. We want adults to be able to also be aware of their biases. That is really one of the core pieces that will help make the system more equitable for all of our students. So within MTSS, it really is a framework that holds it all together and allows the adults to integrate all of these pieces in a really seamless way that makes sense for the needs of their students. So everyone's MTSS framework is not going to look the same, and their MTSS team is not going to look the same, but we want teams to have the flexibility to design a system that works for your students and that integrates culturally responsive practices and strong social emotional competencies so that students and adults are able to really produce positive outcomes.
Yeah, and you know, I see some questions too, since we're throwing a lot of acronyms at people. So I want to take just a quick moment. MTSS, we're referring to a multi-tiered system of support that is typically thought of as a triangle, a graphic that says we have universal supports that are for all students, that support all students academically, behaviorally, socially, emotionally. And then we also provide targeted supports or tier 2 level supports supports some of the students who may need additional levels of support, and tier 3 supports, which are intensive interventions for the smaller population of students who may need those additional supports. That could be academic supports, they could be behavioral supports. Let's talk a little bit within these tiers. What does it mean for social and emotional learning to be part of this tiered system? Are there examples within each of the tiers when you think about integration? And Trish, I know you all have done some work here too, and thinking about what's in tier 1, what's in tier 2, and what's in tier 3. Could you talk a little bit about some of the specific ways that you all have integrated throughout there?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think it's an evolving process, right? And we named at the very beginning of the webinar that the needs of our students and our adults have dramatically changed over the last couple of years. But some concrete examples of things that we have done to help integrate is really looking at the student voice. I'll start with that part, the student voice SEL component around having students. We have student-led conferences here. And that's a huge component where students are reviewing their own data and setting their own goals and really sharing those with their family and identifying what resources they have, what skills they have, what resources they need, and what skills they need to be able to meet some of their long-term goals. We also started a project with that this year with middle school math, looking at the common formative assessments, where we're having our students review those protocols and then look at what they did well and then areas they miss, and then they design their own learning plan and really develop this ownership of learning. And that bleeds across all tiers, right? Where we're not seeing a specific intervention, but we're seeing students have ownership of that. We also look at we do have a social emotional competency assessment that we use. We do not drill down to individual students, but we look at that and in aggregate and think about what skills are our students telling us are most difficult for them, and how can we provide opportunities for practice throughout the school day. So I think that's an important component. I know when we support our schools, sometimes there's misunderstanding around a universal behavior screener, a mental health screener, and a social emotional competency assessment, and the way in which we would use that. So I think just looking at how, I included our data dashboard as one of the articles and related components, but when you look, our students will tell us things like being polite to an adult is incredibly easy for them, but they'll also tell us that joining a group of friends that they are unfamiliar with or inviting someone to join them is very difficult for them. So those are ways in which we can tangibly integrate. And we also, when we look at triangulation of data, when you think of the problem-solving framework, one of the major components is that database decision-making and having multiple data sets, and using that student voice component, using that social emotional competency assessment as a data point to give you more information about the health of your entire system is a critical element, and really only can come from integration.
And Dr. Jackson, I know you've talked a lot about how SEL should serve as a universal level of support. And curious if you could describe a little bit more how SEL plays a role within the different tiers. Is it running through all the tiers? Is it integrated? Is it an umbrella over the tiers? How do you think of this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the way that I think of it is that SEL does run through all of the tiers, but it really is taught and learned in tier 1. So tier 1 is that core instructional program and curriculum where all students have access, your students with disabilities, your English language learners, all of students have access to core instruction. And within core instruction is where we need all of our teachers, we need all hands on deck to really make sure that students are learning social emotional skills and that they are practicing those skills, because that really is where we want SEL to be taught. One caution that we describe in the toolkit is that we want to make sure that people are not tiering SEL. So we don't want to think of it as an intervention or as a tier 2 SEL that looks different than tier 1. What we want to do is in tier 2, which is for your students who need supplemental support, who have additional learning needs. We want Tier 2 to be a place where teachers are able to reinforce what happened at Tier 1. So if you learned self-management at Tier 1, we want Tier 2 to be a place where those teachers are reinforcing and giving students opportunities to demonstrate self-management. Now at Tier 2 and Tier 3, we have students who have additional learning needs or behavioral needs, especially at Tier 3. We may have students that have multiple complex needs. And that is where we want teachers to be able to use explicit instruction and scaffolding and some more concrete supports to help students actually demonstrate those skills, right? So at Tier 2 and Tier 3, we may see teachers use a reinforcement chart or have prompts for students, or students may have little stickies on their desk to remind them to breathe and take a minute before they engage in a difficult task, right? So that is just as important, I would argue even more important at Tier 2 and Tier 3 to reinforce those social emotional skills, because that's where students are really working on something that's difficult, right? It's kind of a perfect opportunity for students to exercise those social emotional skills that they learned at Tier 1 as they're engaging in difficult tasks in an area that's not their strength. We really want to make sure that students have the opportunity to exercise those skills and get feedback from their teachers around how to use those skills and additional strategies and supports. So that's how I think of SEL integrated into MTSS. And I see MTSS as the overarching framework. So that really is kind of the umbrella. It holds together all of your staffing, your database decision-making, your decisions about resources and about the continuum of supports and what that looks like. And within those tiers, SEL is very prevalent throughout all of those tiers. And it is just reinforced in more concrete ways at Tiers 2 and 3.
Trish, is that how you all see that in Washoe too? Is that how you're thinking of it when you in your interventions at Tier 2 and 3 rather than a SEL intervention? How do you focus on social skills, emotional skills without that confusion?
Yeah, I definitely agree with Dr. Jackson. And I think it can get confusing for practitioners, right? Because we have social emotional competency assessments and they're almost pre-programmed. Well, we have an assessment, we see a student is stronger here, or there's some skill gaps here, so then we need to have specific interventions there. And I think that helping folks understand that we don't want to have just a different level of SEL instruction for Tier 2 or Tier 3. And I appreciate her examples of how we can integrate social emotional learning. And I think, you know, when we think about behavior or attendance, and I have a background in behavior analysis, so I really subscribe to behavior is communication, and it does let us know what skills are missing. And so you can drill down into some specific skill sets that may relate to social emotional learning, but when you're in that Tier 2, Tier 3, the targeted and more individualized opportunities, you really can think about what are the opportunities for our students to practice or reinforce that social emotional competency. I think the examples I gave around academics, specifically with math, is a great example of where we're having a strong level of integration when we're having our students look at their common formative assessments, reflect on their learning, and identify what they need to do to move to the next level and fill in some of those skill gaps. They're demonstrating a high level of social emotional competence there, and we're allowing them to practice that goal setting and organization, self-management, self-awareness, and then they have to turn around and communicate it, but the intervention is all based on math. Right? I mean, we're really looking at how are we supporting students in algebra who may have skill gaps, yet we have strong levels of integrated social emotional learning throughout the intervention. So that would be an example, I think, of what Dr. Jackson said.
Yeah, I love those connections that you're looking across behavior, social emotional skills, academics. And I want to pick up on that theme also because we've gotten a lot of questions around PBIS, which is positive behavior interventions. and supports, which is another tiered framework that a lot of schools use to think about behaviors. And want to ask you both, how do you think about the differences, similarities between MTSS and PBIS? How do they connect to each other, and how does SEL connect to all of this? I think we're trying to triangulate a lot of different frameworks in education all the time, knowing that people already have PBIS systems in place. And how have you thought about that integration?
Yeah, that's a great question, because we don't have enough acronyms in education, so we just wanted to put them all together. I think the integration of PBIS and MTSS is also an area that really can be done seamlessly, but it has to start with that MTSS team. So you would want to pick an entry point, if you will. So if you want to start with integration, you may want to start by integrating your data or integrating your instruction. And you would start there by integrating both behavior data. Say you want to go with data, integrating data from behavior and data around academics and looking at them together. Steve Goodman and Kent McIntosh have a great book around integrating MTSS and PBIS with some really great resources there. So I would recommend that if anyone is getting started on integrating PBIS and MTSS. And they're both tiered frameworks, and they work really well together. It's really just a matter of taking a small bite at a time and figuring out where you want to start, and then starting with one piece and integrating there. So if you're starting with data, starting with that piece. If you want to start with instruction at tier 1, that may be a good place to start. And having that MTSS team really outline and clearly explain to staff, what does that look like for us? When are we integrating this, and what does that look like in our school?
Yeah, and on a very practical level, I think Trish and Washoe, there were a lot of schools already implementing PBIS for a while, right? When you all began introducing SEL and MTSS, can you talk a little bit on a practical level too? How did that look to integrate that, and what was that process like?
Yeah, I think I'll go with that PBIS SEL angle, just to build on what Dr. Jackson was saying. So when we first started, like I said, our schools had been implementing PBIS for over 10 years. So we had a strong background in that. And I think if you don't intentionally connect and help people have language around how they connect and how they can support one another, you end up with statements like, well, we don't do PBIS because we do SEL, or we don't do SEL because we do equity work, right? And so you have to help them intentionally move forward. Very tangible activities that we did. All of our schools had posted matrices, and we had them bring those and look at them through an SEL cultural competency lens. One big shift that we made, we found a lot of posted expectations around the building had a few things that we changed because of our work with SEL. One, everything was the students will, students will, students will. We changed our language to we. So instead of having expectations, we shifted to agreements. When we are in community together, this is how we agree to be. And so making that shift, bringing in student and family caregiver voice was very important in that. And then we went through activities around, well, what does this look like, sound like, and feel like for teachers, students, and our community around, like, if we're looking at a set of expectations, how do we as adults model that? How does that show up for us? How do we reinforce it for each other? When you think of PBIS, right, there is that element of teach, reteach, and reinforce. How can we bring in our families and caregivers so they see themselves in these agreements? How can we create a community where they have a sense of belonging? And then we looked at another critical component of PBIS, which are those precise praise components that are often linked to the token economy, the tickets, and talked about what are we offering precise praise around and what behaviors are we hoping to reinforce as a community. And I think that shift from doing things to students, and this is about how students will behave, to this is how we are in community when we are together, and this is how we agree to be in this space, really changed the way that we implement Pbis, social emotional learning. And we saw an improvement in attendance and student behaviors when we made that shift, because then it was a space for everyone. And we all agreed to conduct ourselves in that way. And we had really tangible conversations around what that looked like, sound like, and feel like. And that was a half-day training, and then we built on that. We did several subsequential days, and we helped our schools facilitate with student advisory councils or student councils in their building, and we helped them facilitate that when they had the back to school night. And sometimes that could take a year to really come up with something in terms of an agreement. And then of course you have to revisit it every year. But that was a huge shift for us.
I love that framing of the shift from doing things to students to with students. And I think it connects to one of the questions that we're receiving in the Q&A, which is when you're really thinking about how you determine SEL supports in an MTSS system, how are you really ensuring that all students and all adults are involved in this process so that it's not stigmatizing and so that it doesn't limit this work to certain populations, like it's targeting certain populations? What are both your thoughts on that?
I would say it's really important to be intentional about doing that. I think when we are implementing any of the frameworks, whether MTSS or Pbis, it's really intentional to start with an equity lens and be aware of some of the areas where your school struggles in terms of different student groups, and being aware of that and keeping that at the forefront and being intentional about making a system that actually removes those barriers, that actually creates more equitable opportunities for all students, and one in which teachers are able to grow in their practice and become more aware of things that they may be doing that are perpetuating some of these patterns that we're seeing in our data. So I think it really provides an opportunity to start fresh and to have staff look at their data objectively and say, you know what, let's look and see where are some pockets where we really need to bump up our supports, our SEL supports for certain groups of students, or if we need to bump up our awareness of some ways that we could strengthen our practice. I think this is a really good opportunity for that. Kent McIntosh actually published a paper in 2014 that has been really widely used in the Pbis space around vulnerable decision points. And that is, I think, a really critical concept where essentially he builds out this model that says that, teachers don't go into making discipline decisions with, it's not a straight line in terms of I have a bias and I'm going to implement this, decision for certain groups of students. What really happens is that there's a decision point in between there. And really there's a lot of contextual factors that are impacting the decisions that teachers may be making around discipline. And so when they unpack the data, there are certain types of behavior that really came up as more likely to receive ODRs or office discipline referrals, such as noncompliance, right, was one of the areas that was really high. And then there were also times of day that really where those ODRs spiked for different teachers. So and location. So it could be, in the hallway after lunch when you see a lot of ODR spiking, or it could be at the end of the day, right, when everybody's really anxious to leave and teachers are tired and we just want to get it over with. And those are the times when our bias usually comes to the forefront, and we may be making decisions that are more leaning towards bias as opposed to the strategies and skills that we have. So all that to say, it's really important that teachers are aware of what their hot points are, when the times of day are, when they may be hangry, or when students may be a little extra, antsy, and to really be cognizant of those moments throughout the day, and so that we can really interrupt those and create a more equitable system, so that students can have more equitable outcomes, and we can all benefit from our social emotional skills that we've all learned.
Yeah, and I think that data connection really resonates for a lot of folks too. And we've seen how SEL and MTSS can help improve a lot of these different data points. And there's some questions around specifically, is there evidence or examples that you all can share around how it's helped reduce exclusionary discipline, like out of school suspensions in schools? And I know you're some of the disproportionality there as well, Dr. Jackson. So for either of you, have you seen evidence that this actually works to shift some of those practices?
Yeah, I think when we're implementing, we have different data sets over the years. I would say the last 2 years are very unique in terms of our data set. So I don't think I would point, it's very noisy, but we definitely see, when we look at strong implementation of SEL, we see these indicators that we weren't expecting to see necessarily, in addition to the things that are typically cited, right? Going back to the, Durlac meta-analyses around academic achievement and those types of things, but we also saw teacher attendance increase. And we saw fewer behavior issues because we have teachers who are experiencing less feelings of stress and burnout. And to Dr. Jackson's just point there, we know when teachers are feeling more stressed and more burnt out, we see an increase in behavioral incidents and an increase in absenteeism, both on the part of the student and the teacher. So yes, and we also know one of the things we say in Washoe is behavior goes where reinforcement flows, right? And the more that we can reinforce agreed upon expectations in our community, the more likely we're going to see those happen over and over again. So I would say, yes, it is definitely worthwhile. And when we look at those data, I often remind educators that typically one behavioral incident takes 2 hours from beginning to end of your time. And so then when we do reductions in behavioral incidents, we actually show them in number of hours gained back of instructional time and of staff time.
Yeah, I think that's really important, especially now too. Staying on the theme of data as well, we touched a little bit on the differences between screeners and the role of social emotional competency assessments, but I want to lift that up a little bit more explicitly to ask you, what is the role of screeners within MTSS, and how do screeners for behavioral health issues or other things differ from social and emotional competency assessments, and how those should be used?
Yeah, screeners is one of those areas we want to be really careful with because it is a term that's used differently for different reasons. So within MTSS, we promote the use of universal screeners, which are valid, reliable assessments that are given to all students to identify areas where they may be at risk for future learning challenges, right? So we, again, with MTSS, the screener is really important as that preventative aspect. So it lets us know, this student, if they don't receive an intervention, down the line, they may be 2 or 3 years below grade level. And we want to prevent that now. So we want to give them an intervention now. When we talk about screeners for SEL, we don't want to use it in that same way, right? We want to use screeners to really inform the overall school program and to allow us to identify areas that we may want to emphasize across the school. So we're not with an SEL screener, we're not looking for individual student needs. I was really glad to hear Trish say, we're not drilling down to individual students. We're not trying to diagnose students. We are really trying to help our programming as an overall school. So even though it's called a screener, it is definitely used very differently than a universal assessment, a universal screener. The other piece is that SEL screeners are not meant to be used as valid, reliable tools in that way to predict risk. That's not their purpose. So we want to make sure that we are using the right assessments for the correct purpose.
I couldn't underscore that enough. We have over 100 schools, and I've spent a lot of time working with our educators, particularly in the last few years, and they're so hungry for information, and they're so worried about the increased level of anxiety or mental health, mental wellness needs that they're seeing in their building, and they want to respond to that. And so they're saying, well, we need to do a we need a screener for SEL, and they really blend together mental health screeners, behavioral screeners, and our social emotional competency assessments as one thing. And really helping them understand the differences and the information that you can give, just to underscore Dr. Jackson's points. I think that's a common pitfall that we see schools, well-intentioned educators falling into right now. And I think just being aware of when you're looking at that, what information does that give you? And then how can you respond?
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think that distinguishing those is really important as people think about the data sources that they need to use with SEL and MTSS. One of the concerns I know a lot of folks have right now, given the current climate, is how do you make this all work when there are shortages with teaching staff, counselors, and social workers? And we have a question around, like, do you have advice? Just how can they actually emulate this type of model where they're being very intentional with MTSS and SEL, given the challenges that a lot of the schools are facing?
Yeah, I mean, my advice would be advice that I give all of my MTSS teams and schools that I work with across the country, which is start small and just bite off one piece. So if you're starting this year, we know that we're entering yet another year where we have many of the same challenges that we've had in the past couple of years. I would say, choose one area that you really want to do well as a school in terms of implementing SEL. It could be implementing SEL, within tier 2, or it could be implementing, one or two specific competencies that you really want students to master this year. So I would just say to bite off one piece. Don't feel like you have to take this huge framework and put it all together and have everything aligned perfectly and beautifully integrated before you do anything. I would say just start with one aspect of it. You can start with, one of the core components of MTSS, whether it's screening or database decision making or one of the tiers. And I would say start with one of those and focus on that for this year and just take it slow. It's better to do it well and slow than fast and then, throw it all out next year because you're like, oh, that didn't work.
Yeah, and I think just to build on that, if you're starting or restarting, I think is also a fair assessment with staff transiency and some of the challenges we've had over the last couple of years. I think helping to even some of the questions we've had on this webinar, right? What's the difference between Pbis and MTSS? I think starting to first build common language and common understanding. So what are these things that we're talking about? And how are they working together? And then are there distinct differences that your staff need to be aware of? And then another component that I think is a critical area where we want to do so much and we sometimes do too much. We stress ourselves out too much. So I think really critically looking at first the role of the teacher teams and leadership teams you have in your building and how the role and the goal of those teams and how they support the goals that Dr. Jackson just identified. If you pick your one, look at what who's supporting those goals and what are the role and goal of those teams. Sometimes we go in and they're like, well, we have a school climate team, we have a Pbis team, we have a restorative practices team, we have an SEL team, we have an equity team. And do you really need all of that? And how can we pare that down and really focus? So when she's saying start small and be very intentional, the role and goal of your teacher and leadership teams, particularly in a time where we have less staff to accomplish our goals, I think is a critical step, sort of that pruning.
Yeah, thank you. So we're getting some questions from the audience specifically around equity, which we've touched on. But I want to sort of help put some finer points on it. Can you expand a little bit about what the equity strategies actually look like? Are there sets of questions for an equity lens that districts should be considering? How do they think about power differentials? And just, you know, anything more concrete that either of you can share on what an equity lens actually looks like within the MTSS and SEL integrated structures.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I would say, you know, one of the most powerful things that you can do to increase equity is to disaggregate your data. A lot of our schools have so much data and they don't have time or even think to stop and disaggregate it by subgroup or by student group to say, you know, how are all of our students doing? How are, not just in the aggregate, but when we pull them out into different groups, are each of our student groups achieving at the same rate? And what do we need to do? And really just having a hard conversation, not, you know, looking for blame, but just coming up with solutions amongst your leadership team around, you know, this is what our data shows. And what can we do to actually address this? You know, do we need to have training on culturally responsive practices? Do we need to build better relationships with our students and stronger relationships? Do we need to have stronger relationships with our family community and really bring them in as partners in what we're doing? So just having those really clear conversations around data, I think, is really important. And then also keeping SEL as a lever for equity. So self-management and self-awareness, you know, respecting differences and being aware of when is it important and how can we actually get to know one another in a way that maybe we haven't been intentional about before. So I would say using those SEL competencies to really drill down on some areas is a really good strategy. There's also a resource that I shared that allows staff to go through the vulnerable decision point framework and think about, you know, what are some biases that may be coming into play here? What are some times of day that may impact us? What are some cultural norms that I may be reinforcing that I'm not aware of? So there are some really pointed questions on that handout that I thought were really helpful. And just stepping back and thinking about, you know, we all have biases that we bring. There are certain things that are really, you know, a hot button for me that may not be a hot button for you. And a lot of that is laden with cultural norms that we're just, you know, it's like in the water. It's something that's there. We don't really think about it or see it. But we really want to be intentional about pausing, thinking about, you know, personally, what are my biases and what are some cultural norms that as a school are our school culture that we reinforce, right? That may be, that may not be in alignment with our student population. So those are just a couple of strategies that I would say to start with.
Yeah, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to build on a couple more strategies that we've used over the years that have really worked. So Dr. Jackson mentioned pulling out your disproportionality data, and she was using sort of the big 5 time of day, location, that kind of thing to inform not only your duty schedule, right, but where are our biases showing up and how can we address that? We've worked with our school teams before to look at their disproportionality data and really pick one area to focus on and then write tangible goals SMART goals, if you will. And then we connected that to the SPP, and we had them just focus on one thing. And then we really drilled down into what are the action steps that we need to do to move forward. And a big step with that actually is just having schools understand that disproportionality does occur, right? It's in your building. Yes, these are your data, but then just having them start and pick one area. We also use Curtis Linton's Equity 101. He has the equity framework. I think that's a nice, easy start for schools. Something tangible that we have taken to is in front of all of our data books. We have the equity framework, and we have 4 or 5 questions that teams can ask around who is this supporting. And then when we train, we put it on that bright neon bright paper, and we have that, and we have schools, we reference it first, we have them review the questions, and then we get them into their data just to keep it very present. And the last tangible piece that I think is very doable for schools and for teachers is using ISIL, right? Having them first look at instruction, curriculum, environment, and then the learner. When they're examining all of those practices first before the student, that is a way in which you can bring equity forward.
Thank you. And you both mentioned different types of data, and there's discipline data. Can you name specifically what are some of the other types of data that you think are really important for folks to disaggregate and take a close look at as they're thinking about SEL and MTSS?
Sure. I would say your screening data, so your universal screener for reading or for math or for behavior. Your progress monitoring data. You could use your summative and cumulative data that you are giving in classrooms, exit tickets, or even just grades on tests, looking at achievement data. It's all different types of student achievement data. Yeah, I could go on. There's any type of data, but I would say the data that your school looks at to make decisions most often. So, but I would make sure to include your universal screening data. If you're using a math screener or a literacy screener, that would definitely be where I would start.
And the only thing I would add to that is looking at attendance and transiency.
Mm-hmm.
I think those are critical components of how our students are doing and how well they can respond, both in terms of academic, behavioral, social, emotional, and our teachers too at this point.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you both for the rich conversation that gave us lots of strong ideas and challenges to think about, as well as really concrete examples and helping folks think through and break down what does this all actually mean. Really appreciate the time that you've spent with us. We want to wrap up with a few just key takeaways from this conversation and invite you all in the audience to reflect on your key takeaways as we're wrapping up this conversation. One big key takeaway for me here is that SEL is really about strengthening the whole continuum of supports when we're thinking about children holistically and all of their needs. So we're not thinking about sides of a triangle or separate interventions, but that all of these needs, social, emotional, academic, behavioral, are all integrated, very, very connected. Two, I think, Dr. Jackson, you made this point early on, is that the universal social and emotional learning supports are really core and foundational for every student. And when we're thinking about SEL instruction, when we're thinking about supportive climate, these are essential supports for that should be part of education for every child. So we think of them at the universal level. And lastly, I think, so we're thinking about any policy implications here. Looking at a continuum of supports like MTSS helps to create that structure and framework in order to be able to effectively implement social and emotional learning systemically. And I think Trish offered some really great examples within Washoe for being able to do that.